What is unfolding is not just another controversy in a long sequence of political turbulence. It is a measurable shift in how loyalty operates under pressure, specifically when symbolic boundaries are crossed. The recent episode involving religious imagery and escalating rhetoric has triggered a reaction that is qualitatively different from previous cycles of outrage. It is not primarily driven by opposition voices. It is emerging from within the president's own support structure. For years, the stability of that support has depended on a predictable mechanism. Political identity, cultural alignment, and perceived representation created a buffer against criticism. Supporters were willing to reinterpret controversial actions because they believed the underlying alignment remained intact. That mechanism is now under strain. The reason is structural. Religion is not a negotiable layer of identity for many within the coalition. When political messaging intersects with sacred symbolism, the cost of defending that messaging increases sharply. This is not about disagreement over policy or tone. It is about perceived violation of something foundational. The reaction reflects that distinction. Voices that have historically defended the president across multiple controversies are now expressing discomfort in direct terms. This is not strategic distancing designed to manage optics. The language is more categorical: offense, disrespect, and rejection, rather than reinterpretation. That shift indicates that the usual reframing strategies are failing. In previous cases, controversial behavior could be recast as deliberate provocation or tactical communication. Supporters could maintain alignment by viewing it as part of a broader political strategy. In this instance, that reinterpretation pathway is limited. Religious symbolism resists strategic reframing because it operates within a moral framework rather than a political one. This creates internal tension. Supporters are forced to reconcile long-standing political loyalty with a perceived breach of religious respect. That reconciliation is not immediate. It does not produce instant defection. Instead, it produces erosion, subtle but cumulative. Erosion is more consequential than abrupt shifts because it affects engagement levels. Voters who remain nominally aligned may become less active, less vocal, and less motivated to participate. In midterm environments, where turnout differentials are decisive, this kind of disengagement carries significant weight. Timing amplifies the effect. The controversy does not exist in isolation. It coincides with broader concerns about economic pressure and foreign policy decisions. Under these conditions, tolerance thresholds are lower. Issues that might otherwise be absorbed become focal points for broader dissatisfaction. This is a well-documented pattern in political behavior. When multiple stress factors align, voters look for concrete moments through which to express abstract frustrations. The religious controversy serves that function. It becomes a proxy for concerns that are otherwise diffuse or complex. This is why the intensity of the reaction exceeds what the incident alone might justify. It is not just about the imagery or the rhetoric. It is about what those actions signal: prioritization of spectacle over discipline, personal expression over strategic coherence. For a segment of the base, that perception challenges a core assumption: that the president acts in alignment with their values, even when his methods are unconventional. Once that assumption is questioned, the foundation of loyalty shifts. Institutional reactions reinforce this dynamic. Responses from aligned political figures are cautious but notable. The language is calibrated. Phrases like "not helpful" or "should avoid." But the underlying message is clear. There is recognition of political risk. This reflects feedback from constituents. Elected officials tend to mirror early voter sentiment, especially when that sentiment carries electoral implications. Their responses indicate that the issue has moved beyond media discourse and into voter-level concern. That transition is critical because it transforms a narrative problem into a strategic one. At the same time, there is no coordinated break within the political structure. Incentives still favor alignment. However, the presence of even limited criticism signals that unconditional support is weakening at the margins. Those margins matter. Political coalitions do not collapse suddenly. They contract gradually. The early stages of contraction are often visible only through changes in tone and engagement, rather than outright opposition. This moment fits that pattern. The key variable is repetition. If similar incidents occur, each one will require supporters to navigate the same internal conflict. Over time, that process becomes more difficult. The cost of maintaining alignment increases, and the willingness to absorb new controversies decreases. This is where long-term risk develops. A base that is less willing to defend and less motivated to engage is functionally smaller, even if headline support numbers remain stable. That distinction is critical in competitive electoral environments. What makes this moment significant is not the scale of the controversy, but the direction of the response. When criticism intensifies within a coalition, it signals a disruption in alignment between leadership behavior and supporter identity. That disruption, if sustained, has implications that extend well beyond a single news cycle. Beyond the immediate backlash, a more consequential issue is emerging: the erosion of narrative control. Political power at the executive level is not only about policy execution, it is also about the ability to define the terms of public discourse. Historically, the president has demonstrated a consistent ability to dominate that space, forcing both allies and opponents to react within a framework he established. That capability appears to be weakening. The current cycle of events illustrates a shift from proactive narrative construction to reactive positioning. Instead of setting the agenda, the administration is responding to multiple overlapping controversies: religious backlash, economic concerns, and foreign policy uncertainty, without a coherent, unifying message. This fragmentation has strategic consequences. When narrative control is lost, perception gaps widen. Different segments of the electorate begin to interpret events through divergent lenses, and the administration's ability to consolidate those interpretations diminishes. This creates an environment where criticism is not only more frequent, but also more difficult to counter. The economic dimension is particularly relevant. Rising energy costs and market volatility introduce tangible, everyday concerns for voters. Unlike symbolic controversies, economic pressures are directly experienced. They do not require interpretation, they are felt. This reduces the effectiveness of rhetorical strategies that rely on reframing or deflection. In this context, communication discipline becomes critical. However, the current pattern suggests inconsistency. Messaging shifts between defensive explanations, counterattacks, and unrelated commentary. This lack of coherence reinforces the perception of strategic drift. Foreign policy adds another layer of complexity: the escalation of conflict and its economic implications, particularly in energy markets, have created a feedback loop. Policy decisions influence economic conditions, which in turn influence public perception. Without a clear articulation of objectives and outcomes, that loop amplifies uncertainty. Uncertainty is politically expensive. Voters may tolerate risk if they perceive a defined strategy. They are less tolerant when outcomes appear unpredictable or disconnected from stated goals. The current situation lacks a clearly communicated framework that explains both the rationale and the expected trajectory of policy decisions. This gap is being filled by external interpretations. Media coverage, political opponents, and even some aligned commentators are constructing narratives that emphasize inconsistency and lack of direction. Once those narratives gain traction, they become self-reinforcing. Each new event is interpreted through that lens, further entrenching the perception. Another factor is leadership visibility. The presidency traditionally involves selective visibility, engaging directly on issues that require authority while delegating others. In the current environment, visibility is high, but not always aligned with strategic priorities. Appearances and statements sometimes focus on peripheral issues rather than central policy challenges. This misalignment affects credibility. When public communication does not correspond to the issues voters consider most important, it creates a perception gap. Voters question whether leadership is focused on the same priorities they are experiencing. Additionally, there is a noticeable shift in rhetorical structure. Statements are becoming longer, less focused, and more tangential. This has implications beyond style. Clarity of communication is directly linked to perceived competence. When messaging becomes diffuse, it undermines confidence in decision-making processes. This is not solely a communication issue. It reflects broader questions about internal coordination. Effective governance requires alignment between policy development, communication strategy, and execution. Discrepancies between these elements suggest internal fragmentation. Fragmentation reduces efficiency. Decisions take longer to implement, messaging becomes inconsistent, and external stakeholders, both domestic and international, receive mixed signals. This complicates negotiations, alliances, and market responses. At the same time, opposition narratives are becoming more cohesive. Critics are framing the current situation as a combination of overreach and underperformance, assertive in rhetoric, but inconsistent in execution. This framing is gaining traction because it aligns with observable patterns. The challenge for the administration is not simply to counter criticism, but to reestablish a coherent narrative that integrates policy, communication, and public perception. That requires discipline. Without it, each new controversy will not be isolated. It will be interpreted as part of a broader pattern of instability. Over time, that pattern becomes the dominant perception, regardless of individual policy outcomes. The strategic risk is cumulative. Loss of narrative control does not produce immediate collapse. It produces gradual erosion of credibility, which then affects the ability to mobilize support, negotiate effectively, and maintain political leverage. This is the phase where perception begins to shape reality. Once voters and stakeholders internalize a narrative of inconsistency or decline, reversing that perception becomes significantly more difficult. It requires sustained, coherent action across multiple domains, not isolated responses to individual events. At present, that level of coherence is not clearly visible, and that absence is becoming a defining feature of the current political environment.